Millions of people up and down the East Coast are being told to get ready right now for a 10-day stretch that forecasters are calling genuinely dangerous. Not just warm, not just sticky and uncomfortable. Dangerous, to the point that cities are opening cooling centers before the worst of the pattern has even arrived. So what exactly is heading our way, and why are meteorologists this rattled about it? If staying a step ahead of major weather stories matters to you, go ahead and subscribe now, because breaking down forecasts like this one is what we do every single week. At the center of all this is something forecasters call a heat dome. The name almost sounds gentle when you say it out loud, but it's actually one of the more dangerous setups our atmosphere can produce. A heat dome forms when a huge zone of high pressure builds and parks itself over a region, trapping hot air underneath the way a lid traps steam over a pot. The air has nowhere to go. It can't rise, it can't escape, so it just keeps cooking day after day, with almost no outlet for that heat to release. This isn't the first appearance of this heat dome this summer, either. Around the 4th of July, this same pattern made headlines when it scorched the middle of the country before sliding east and shattering all-time heat records in cities that almost never see numbers like this. Atlantic City set an all-time high. Newark climbed into the triple digits. Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York's Central Park all broke daily records, with Central Park hitting the triple digits for the first time in almost 14 years. That was round 1. Forecasters are now warning that round 2 is on its way, and this second wave could end up being just as intense, maybe even more disruptive, because of how it's expected to interact with something else moving in at the exact same time. Here's where things start to get serious, so if you didn't realize just how tangled these weather systems can get, this is a good moment to hit that like button. Meteorologists are tracking 2 separate forces converging over the East Coast in the coming days. The first is the heat dome itself, rebuilding over the central United States and pushing its outer edge toward the mid-Atlantic and Northeast. Forecasters expect highs to climb into the upper 90s and touch the 100-degree mark in major cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C., with heat index values. What the air actually feels like once humidity is factored in, climbing as high as 105 to 110 degrees in some spots. The second force is moisture. Tropical and subtropical moisture has been streaming into the east, partly fed by disturbances out in the Gulf, and partly by the sheer volume of humid air being drawn northward ahead of the heat dome itself. When that much moisture runs into a boundary of cooler air pushing down from the north, it doesn't just build a few clouds, it becomes fuel. Fuel for severe thunderstorms, torrential downpours, and flash flooding that can erupt with very little warning. That combination, blistering heat pressing in from one direction and explosive storm potential building from another, is exactly why forecasters are describing the next 10 days as a two-front event rather than a standard heat wave. Let's start with the heat itself, because this isn't just about a few sweaty afternoons. Extreme heat is, statistically, the deadliest weather phenomenon in the United States. It claims more lives every year than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods combined. What's making meteorologists especially uneasy about this round is the humidity behind it. When dew points climb into the 70s, the air becomes so saturated that sweat can no longer evaporate off your skin efficiently. Your body's built-in cooling system essentially stalls out. Add in overnight lows that barely dip, and there's almost no recovery window for anyone without dependable air conditioning. Some meteorologists have taken to calling this pattern a steam cooker effect. Air so thick and heavy with moisture that walking outside feels less like stepping into sunshine and more like stepping into a sauna that never shuts off. Heat advisories and extreme heat warnings already stretch across a massive portion of the country. Tens of millions of people currently fall under major or extreme heat risk classifications from the National Weather Service, meaning real health consequences aren't just a possibility, they're expected. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into the second half of this forecast, because what happens once this heat finally starts to break may end up being even more dangerous than the heat itself. As the heat dome eventually starts to weaken and shift position, it doesn't just quietly fade into the background. Meteorologists point out that the edges of a collapsing heat dome are often where the most violent thunderstorms take shape, because that's precisely where the sharpest temperature contrasts exist in the atmosphere. Forecasters are keeping a close eye on the Great Lakes, the interior Northeast, and the Mid-Atlantic for storms capable of producing damaging straight-line winds, large hail, and even a few isolated tornadoes as this pattern plays out. New England in particular has been flagged as an area of concern, with forecasters warning that any storms rolling through could pack an unusual punch for the region, strong enough to snap trees and take down power lines. That detail matters more than it might seem at first glance, because losing power during a heat wave isn't just an inconvenience for people who depend on air conditioning or home medical equipment. A multi-hour outage in the middle of dangerous heat can turn into a real emergency fast. At the same time, forecasters have already flagged sections of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast for an elevated risk of excessive rainfall and flash flooding as repeated waves of thunderstorms move through over the coming days. Slow-moving storms are the biggest worry here. When a thunderstorm parks itself over the same neighborhood for 30 or 40 minutes, it can unload an enormous amount of rain in a very short window, enough to overwhelm storm drains and turn streets into fast-moving water with barely any warning. This is the part forecasters keep circling back to. It isn't just one hazard. It's heat, followed by storms, followed by flooding risk, all stacked back-to-back across a 10-day window, with the possibility that the whole cycle repeats itself more than once. If this kind of detailed forecast breakdown is useful to you, stick around, because we're tracking this system daily as new model data comes in. There's also a bigger climate picture worth understanding here. Scientists who study long-term weather trends have noted that heat waves nationwide are becoming more frequent, more intense, and longer lasting. A shift they tie back to a warming global climate. The baseline is already warmer than it used to be, so when a heat dome sets up shop, it's starting from a hotter floor than it would have decades ago. That helps explain why numbers that once felt like rare extremes are starting to show up more than once in a single summer. It's also worth noting that this year's atmospheric backdrop includes a strong El Niño pattern, which tends to shape storm tracks and moisture transport across North America. El Niño years often bring a quieter Atlantic hurricane season overall, but that doesn't stop intense, homegrown storm systems from forming right along the coastline, fed by warm ocean water and abundant atmospheric moisture. So what does all of this actually mean if you live anywhere between the mid-Atlantic and New England over the next 10 days? Expect the opening stretch to be dominated by dangerous heat, with highs near or above 100 degrees. Outdoor plans during peak afternoon hours carry real health risks, particularly for children, older adults, and anyone with limited access to cooling. Expect that heat to eventually give way, not to relief, but to a stretch of unsettled, storm-prone weather carrying the potential for damaging wind gusts, hail, and flash flooding, especially in cities and low-lying neighborhoods. And expect forecasters to keep fine-tuning the exact timing, because a pattern this active remains genuinely difficult to pin down more than a few days out. That uncertainty is actually one of the more honest parts of this story. Meteorologists aren't claiming to know the exact hour storms will roll through your specific town. What they are confident about is the broader pattern: extreme heat, followed by an unusually active and potentially dangerous stretch of storms. For anyone in the path of this forecast, the guidance has been consistent. Take extreme heat warnings seriously, check in on elderly neighbors, have a plan ready for sudden storms, and keep checking updated forecasts daily. There's something almost fitting about how this particular 10-day stretch is playing out. It isn't shaping up to be one dramatic, single-day disaster. It's a slow-building sequence. Heat stacking on top of more heat, then colliding with sudden bursts of violent weather, with each hazard setting the stage for the next one. That's exactly why meteorologists across multiple forecasting agencies are speaking with unusual unity right now. This isn't ordinary summer weather. It's a multi-stage event, and by most accounts, it's only just getting started. Let's get into the actual numbers for a moment. Meteorologists tracking this pattern say the core of the heat dome will initially sit over the north-central United States, the same general region that saw temperatures reach 115 degrees in parts of Montana just days earlier. From there, the outer edges of that same high-pressure system are forecast to stretch eastward, first pushing triple-digit heat into the Dakotas and toward New Hampshire, before scorching conditions arrive across the mid-Atlantic shortly after. That timing matters because it gives forecasters a rough blueprint for how the heat will move city by city. New York City is expected to approach the upper 90s, potentially flirting with daily records. Philadelphia is forecast to hit somewhere around 100 degrees, with the heat index pushing what it actually feels like closer to 105. Washington, D.C. and Baltimore are both expected to see similar numbers. Meanwhile, states further inland, including parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and even sections of the Midwest that already baked through record heat earlier this month, are being placed back under extreme heat warnings for a second time. This isn't a brand new hazard appearing out of nowhere. It's the same underlying weather engine cycling back through many of the same communities for a second, and in some cases a third round this summer. Now let's shift over to the storm side of this forecast. As the heat dome begins to weaken along its northern and eastern edges, meteorologists expect increasingly frequent rounds of thunderstorms to fire up, particularly stretching from the Great Lakes into New England. These storms form specifically because the temperature contrast at the boundary of a heat dome tends to be sharp. And sharp temperature contrasts are exactly what fuels strong, sometimes severe, convection. Meteorologists have specifically flagged the risk of damaging straight-line winds capable of snapping tree limbs and knocking down power lines, along with large hail and a low but real risk of isolated tornadoes. Forecasters have also pointed to a repeating pattern of frontal boundaries draped across the Mid-Atlantic and Ohio Valley, each one capable of triggering its own fresh round of thunderstorms as it slides through. The atmosphere is expected to stay unusually moisture-rich for days. Any storm that develops carries the potential to produce extremely heavy rainfall rates, sometimes an inch or more per hour, more than enough to overwhelm storm drains in dense urban areas. Large portions of the northern Mid-Atlantic and southern New England are under an elevated risk of flash flooding on multiple separate days within this window. That means residents in low-lying neighborhoods and anyone who's dealt with flooding before should treat this as a recurring risk rather than a single event. Here's another piece worth understanding. A broad, strong El Niño is currently shaping global weather patterns this year. While El Niño years tend to suppress overall hurricane formation across the Atlantic, they can still allow smaller, homegrown tropical disturbances to develop close to shore. Even without an officially named storm, that tropical moisture can still feed directly into the same storm systems working their way up the East Coast, meaning you don't necessarily need a hurricane to get hurricane-level rainfall rates. So let's bring this back down to something practical. What should people actually be watching for, day by day, over roughly the next week and a half? Early on, expect heat to be the dominant, most immediate danger, especially during afternoon hours. Meteorologists are strongly recommending that people limit strenuous outdoor activity, stay hydrated well before they start feeling thirsty, and check in on elderly relatives or neighbors. Older adults are disproportionately affected by extreme heat, often without realizing how quickly warning signs can escalate. As the pattern starts to transition, keep an eye out for sudden shifts in the sky, clouds darkening quickly, a rapid drop in temperature, or a noticeable pickup in wind. All three can signal a fast-developing thunderstorm is on the way. Having a weather alert system active on your phone is one of the simplest ways to get warned in time to take shelter. Throughout this entire window, flooding remains a quiet but serious risk, particularly overnight, when people are less likely to notice rising water until it's already surrounding their vehicle. Meteorologists repeat the same warning every time flash flooding becomes a concern. Never drive through a flooded roadway, even if it looks shallow. Local governments in several major cities have already started opening cooling centers ahead of the worst of the heat, a clear sign of just how seriously officials are treating this stretch. Emergency management agencies are also urging residents to prepare go bags and charge their devices ahead of time. What makes meteorologists most cautious right now isn't any single number on a forecast map. It's the layering. Extreme heat stresses the body. Storms threaten the power grid that keeps air conditioning running. And flooding threatens transportation and infrastructure right as communities are trying to recover from days of oppressive heat. Each hazard on its own is manageable. Stacked back to back, they become something forecasters are treating with real concern. Let's dig a little deeper into why this particular pattern is drawing so much attention, because it isn't just about the raw temperature numbers, it's about duration. A single hot day is uncomfortable. A single hot week is exhausting. But a heat dome that rebuilds itself, weakens, and then threatens to redevelop again within the same 10-day stretch is a different animal entirely. The body doesn't get a real chance to recover, infrastructure doesn't get a real chance to reset, and emergency crews don't get much of a breather between one hazard and the next. That's part of why officials in multiple cities are being unusually proactive this time around, opening cooling centers before the hottest days have even arrived rather than waiting for emergency visits to spike first. This also isn't a story confined to one or two states. The reach of this pattern stretches from the northern plains through the Midwest and across the entire Mid-Atlantic and Northeast corridor, meaning tens of millions of people across very different landscapes are being asked to prepare for the same underlying threat at roughly the same time. That scale is part of what makes coordinating a response so complicated. A cooling center strategy that works in a spread-out rural county looks completely different from one that works in a dense urban core, where heat can linger in concrete and asphalt long after the sun goes down, often called the urban heat island effect. Cities tend to stay several degrees warmer overnight than surrounding areas, which means residents in dense downtown areas may get less overnight relief than people just a short drive outside city limits, even under the same regional forecast. That's part of why meteorologists keep stressing overnight lows as much as daytime highs. A daytime high of 98 sounds dangerous on its own, but when it's paired with an overnight low that only dips into the upper 70s or low 80s, the body never really gets a break. Multiply that across several consecutive days, and the strain on the body becomes far more dangerous than any single afternoon would suggest. This is often described as the real driver behind heat-related hospitalizations. Not the single hottest moment, but the lack of recovery time between one hot day and the next. On the storm side, forecasters are also paying close attention to soil saturation heading into this window. Ground that's already damp from earlier rain can't absorb new rainfall efficiently, which raises the odds of flash flooding, even from storms that wouldn't normally be considered extreme. That's one more reason officials are treating the flooding risk as a rolling threat rather than tied to one specific storm. There's also an infrastructure angle. Extreme heat doesn't just affect people directly. Pavement can buckle under sustained extreme heat, rail lines sometimes have to slow trains to prevent track warping, and airports occasionally adjust operations when temperatures climb high enough to affect aircraft performance. This helps explain why meteorologists are framing this as a multi-system event rather than simply a hot stretch of weather. As for the storms themselves, meteorologists have emphasized that not every storm in this pattern will be severe, and not every day will bring flooding. The concern isn't that every single day turns hazardous. It's that the overall setup increases the odds of hazardous days occurring more frequently than usual. That distinction matters for how people should plan. It doesn't mean canceling every outdoor activity for the next 10 days. It means staying alert, checking forecasts daily, and understanding that this stretch carries a higher than normal chance of sudden, fast-moving hazards showing up with limited notice. Meteorologists have also pointed out that areas with strong heat alert systems, accessible cooling centers, and community check-in networks for vulnerable residents tend to see meaningfully lower rates of heat-related illness compared to areas without those systems, even when the raw temperatures are similar. Pulling all of this together, here's the shape of the next 10 days as forecasters currently see it. The first several days lean heavily toward dangerous heat, with highs near or above 100 degrees across major mid-Atlantic and Northeast cities, and heat index values pushing into the 105 to 110 degree range in the most humid pockets. This is the stretch where health risks are most acute, particularly for children, older adults, outdoor workers, and anyone without dependable access to air conditioning. From there, as the heat dome weakens along its edges, the region transitions into a more unsettled, storm-prone pattern. Expect the potential for damaging straight-line winds, large hail, and a low but real risk of isolated tornadoes, especially across the Great Lakes, interior Northeast, and New England. Layered underneath that storm threat is an ongoing risk of flash flooding, driven by repeated rounds of moisture-rich thunderstorms capable of dropping very heavy rainfall in short bursts. Because this is playing out over roughly 10 days rather than a single day, forecasters are warning the cycle could repeat itself more than once. Heat building back up behind a storm system, only to weaken again and trigger another round of severe weather a few days later. That's the layering meteorologists keep coming back to. Heat stressing the body, storms threatening the power grid, and flooding threatening roads right as communities try to recover from the heat that came before it. The broader takeaway from meteorologists across multiple agencies is fairly unified. This is being treated as a serious, multi-stage weather event, not a routine summer hot spell. Take heat warnings at face value, check in on vulnerable neighbors and relatives, have a plan for sudden severe storms, know which parts of your area are prone to flash flooding, and check forecasts daily rather than assuming Monday's outlook will still hold true by Friday. It's also worth remembering that forecasts for a pattern this complex will keep shifting. What meteorologists are confident about is the broader shape of the pattern, intense heat giving way to an unusually active and potentially dangerous stretch of storms, both driven by the same converging systems. For now, the guidance is straightforward. Prepare for the heat first, since it's the most immediate and statistically deadliest threat in this sequence. Then stay alert for the transition into storms, since that's where the timeline gets hardest to pin down. And throughout the whole window, treat flooding as a real and recurring risk rather than something that only happens during named tropical storms. For anyone in the path of this system, from the mid-Atlantic up through New England, the next 10 days are worth taking seriously, preparing for in advance, and watching closely as they unfold. Stay safe out there.